I want you to take a moment to look back on your teenage years. Yes, really. Oh, come on, can't be that bad. So what were they like? And what were you like at that age? Well, for most of us, it's a mad rush when we're juggling new social demands, trying to meet challenges in school, making choices for the future, all while trying to figure out who we are and where we fit in. Everybody got lost at some point, in some way or another, right? But imagine what it might be like for someone with Asperger's syndrome. This is a high-functioning form of autism spectrum disorder without any intellectual disability or delay in language development. It's characterised by delayed social maturity and social reasoning, an unusual profile of learning abilities, difficulties with communication and control of emotions, intense and highly specific interests, sensory overload, and a handful of other common issues. And what this actually means is that everyday social interactions that most people find easy and enjoyable can be difficult and exhausting. It can be hard to fit in and make friends. Isolation and bullying can be issues, as can falling short of academic potential. And there's a heightened vulnerability to anxiety and depression. I was one of these kids. Maybe you know someone like this as well. We don't have exact figures, but the best estimates are that 1 out of 160 people are affected by some form of autism spectrum disorder. As of 2007, that's 125,000 people in Australia, or 500,000 families. Now, have you ever tried to do something that didn't come naturally to you? It makes you feel pretty dumb, right? Now, when I was a kid, I knew that things like starting and holding a conversation, making friends, managing the impressions that I gave off, these things were difficult. And this knowledge, which was reinforced by the diagnosis of Asperger's, became a belief that these things were impossible. And things like authentic friendships and belonging would be forever beyond my capabilities. And the Asperger's label really became who I was. And there's a whole subculture built around this label. And you get some kids who identify with skate culture, goth culture, maybe immerse themselves in the geek or otaku world. Well, I was an Aspie. And like all subcultures, we had a word to refer to the out group. Neurotypicals. That's what we call them. It's horrible, isn't it? This is intended to avoid saying normal, because that, of course, would imply abnormality for a group who's felt different quite often for their entire lives. But I find that it's attached to a victim identity, an us versus them mentality, and only throws up additional emotional barriers to connecting with people. This was something that stayed with me until I was about 14 or so, and I began to notice a few things around then. First, that people aren't quite as mean-spirited as I had convinced myself that they were. Or maybe they'd just matured a little bit by then, who knows. I was not satisfied with the future that the Asperger's identity seemed to be prescribing. I wanted more and better relationships than the ones that were available to me. And I began to feel that Asperger's wasn't the whole story, or even the main one. I may not be able to choose what comes easily to me, but that doesn't have to dictate how I choose to act. And Asperger's itself is a diagnosis made on behavioural observations. So if I choose to behave differently, what happens? I also began to notice some other things around this age that proved to be very powerful motivators for learning all of the things that Asperger's made difficult. No prizes for guessing what they were. So, I decided I wanted a different story for my life. I settled on an ideal and I fought hard against myself to make that happen. So how'd that turn out? Well, by the time I'd finished high school, I'd made a great circle of friends, I'd taken off intellectually, and I'd smashed all academic expectations. Even took a few shaky steps forward in a little romantic relationship, which promptly fell flat on its face when my family moved to Tasmania. Now, you may be wondering, during all of this, what kind of support was available to a kid with Asperger's? Well, when I went through school, support was very much in its infancy. My high school was the very first one in the country to have autism support built into it in the form of an autism support class. And I was in the first group of students to go through that. And what did that involve? Well, there were the usual concessions of special education, extra time and special conditions in exams, things like that. It we had teacher aides come along to class every so often, which made things a little bit awkward in front of the rest of the class. The teachers, the teaching staff, came from a background of supporting much younger and lower functioning kids. And while they did their best with what they knew, I didn't get a great deal out of it. The class itself catered to as much of the autism spectrum as possible. So I often found myself grouped in with kids with much lower abilities than my own. And on Thursday afternoons, while the rest of the school was at sport, we had social skills classes. And these were a mix of discussion, role play, writing activities, and ugly homebrew teaching resources. This is one that I got when I was about 14 or 15, made with an abominable mix of flashcard clip art, Microsoft Word, and Comic Sans. And it was about toilet hygiene. Now, to be fair, this may have suited one or two of my classmates, but for me, not so much. Now, this seems to be a pretty common experience for people with Asperger's when they seek support. They're either grouped in with the rest of the autism spectrum and people who have very different needs, or they get nothing at all. So, these are the problems that I grew up with. We've got the ordinary challenges of adolescence, which are compounded by the social difficulties associated with Asperger's. The diagnostic label of Asperger's, while it's useful in many respects, can affect personal identity and feelings of self-efficacy. The subculture surrounding that label can foster an us versus them mentality that only throws up additional emotional barriers. The learning style of people with Asperger's can gravitate towards self-direction, and as we've seen, there's not a whole lot of that available in mainstream education. And there's a lack of age-appropriate support and learning resources. And this brings me to the reason why I'm telling you my tale of teenage angst. I've often thought about what advice I'd offer to my younger self, which is really what we're doing whenever we offer advice to anyone. And what I keep coming back to is this. You shouldn't base your sense of self on a diagnosis like Asperger's. That's doing yourself a disservice and holding you back from greater things. You need to get out there and work hard on the things that you find difficult, because the rewards are worth it many times over. And things get better. You can make them better. Nobody's in a better position than you to make those changes. All well and good as far as advice goes, right? But how would it actually go down? A bit like this, I imagine. And that's because raw advice lacks power and it feels irrelevant. A message and its lesson can only carry emotional weight when it's related through a story. Now, in your youth, was there a fictional character that you could really relate to? Maybe had a bit more to him than Captain Generica here. Heroes inspire us. They give us an ideal to work towards. We take lessons from their stories to apply in our own lives. And if you find one in your formative years, it can have a big impact on you for the rest of your life. And I think it's time that kids with Asperger's had a hero like this of their very own. How best to go about this? Well, I'm an illustrator and I love comics. As an art form, they've long since matured, and as a storytelling medium, they're amongst the most accessible, the most versatile, and the most engaging around. I mean, would you have paid as much attention if I'd come up here with slides full of text? So, when I was studying at university, I made a comic book to try and tell this story and fill the gap in support that I grew up with. What I imagined was a comic that tells an engaging story with relatable characters, inspiring readers to take positive action in their own lives. Running parallel to it, I wanted to have educational content that would follow up on this initial inspiration and really give kids a complete package for personal development. Here it is a bit bigger. So what I came up with was a short book that I tentatively named Aspire. I've come a long way since I made this one. The short book I came up with at the time, the story was fairly simple and it drew on a lot of the common characters and themes that you find, especially in Japanese comics, which I absolutely adore. Went something like this. Started with a lonely kid, frustrated with his first few weeks of high school, going for a walk on the beach to clear his head. And washed up on the shore, he finds a magic wish-granting mirror, as you do. Feeling completely sick and sorry for himself, he makes a wish to be a different person. And this isn't something that the mirror can do, so it breaks apart and releases a little spirit companion who will help him realise the true intention behind his wish, which is to make authentic friendships and find a sense of belonging by steering him through his problems and coaching him towards personal development. Oh, here we are. This would lead into a larger episodic story dealing with increasingly more complicated social skills and personal issues. And towards the end, I wanted the character to have a chance to restore this mirror and make another wish. But by this time, he's grown so much that he uses it instead for the sake of someone he's grown close to. Now, the book I came up with at the time couldn't do this idea justice. But it's something that stayed with me as I've been getting my freelance career up and running, and exciting things are starting to take shape around it. And not long after I made the original comic, I showed it to a guy I met in a philosophy summer school unit, James Riggle, former ghost of the Hit Lab, who's also speaking later today. Over the past couple of years, we've been putting together a plan to redo this comic as a big collaborative project and layer in some interesting interactivity through a companion mobile application. And here's how it will all work. Firstly, I'll be collaborating with a professional writer to put together a really strong story and cast of characters to really speak to kids with Asperger's at their own level. We'll be speaking with educators and researchers to make sure the educational content is informed by the latest science and best practices. And as for the companion mobile app, we want that to include a full digital copy of the comic and learning resources, some gamified tasks and challenges, and the crown jewels, an augmented reality mode, which will superimpose 3D imagery over the physical printed book when it's viewed through the device camera. We think this will open up some really exciting new possibilities for storytelling and interaction. We have a team lined up, and we're close to securing funding that will enable us to work for the better part of a year on a first release. And once we have a first volume of the comic and a prototype application, we think that will make a good launchpad for a crowdfunding campaign. We'd like to keep it going until it reaches a satisfying conclusion, the story comes full circle, and we have a complete personal development kit for the teenage years. From there, who knows, maybe we can tackle the primary school years or young adulthood. I think this will have massive appeal to kids with Asperger's and really help to fill the gap in support that I grew up with. I think my younger self would be pretty impressed with it. Heaven knows we can't do much worse than what's out there at the moment. I hope you're excited to see how it all comes together. Thank you very much.